Tonight, we step into the shadows of Blackwood Grove Asylum, a place lost to time and haunted by dark secrets. Abandoned decades ago, this asylum was once notorious for its experimental treatments and the strange disappearances of its patients. But when a group of friends dares to explore its decaying halls, they quickly realize the asylum's twisted past is far from dead. Shadows linger, whispers echo, and a deadly ultimatum awaits. Enter, if you dare, but remember, some places never let you go. Part 1, the beginning of the journey to the forgotten place. So, there we were, 4 friends, sitting in this little cafe we'd always hit up before one of our so-called adventures. This time, Mark had come up with something wild, spending the night in an abandoned hospital on the edge of town. You know, the one everyone whispers about. The place where people supposedly went in but didn't always come out. The rumors? Pretty grim. There were stories about experiments, weird disappearances, maybe even ghosts. I remember looking at him like he was insane. But then again, we'd done some pretty crazy stuff together, so I wasn't about to back down. Dan, though, he was the skeptic. He kept scoffing, trying to play it cool. But even he had that look, you know? Like maybe there was something lurking he didn't want to admit. So, you ready? Mark asked, grinning as he pulled out a flashlight. It was just past midnight, and the whole area was empty and dark. Perfect setting for a horror movie, right? We set off, each of us a little uneasy but trying to hide it from each other. The place loomed in the distance, a massive, shadowy building with boarded-up windows and walls that looked like they'd been untouched for decades. As we walked up to the entrance, I remember feeling my stomach drop. There was this eerie silence, like the whole world was holding its breath. I whispered, "Why do I always let you talk me into this?" Mark just laughed. "Because you love it, admit it." But honestly, the second we stepped inside, I wanted out. The air was stale and heavy, like the walls had soaked up decades of fear. It was pitch dark except for the weak beams of our flashlights, barely cutting through the shadows. And then, bang! The door slammed shut behind us. I swear, my heart jumped into my throat. "Probably just the wind," Dan muttered, though even he sounded shaky. But we all knew there was no breeze that could have slammed that door so hard. We were officially locked in. The walls were cracked and peeling, and as we walked further in, we started noticing weird stains on the floor. Like blood, only old and dried up. And the silence, it was suffocating. Every time we took a step, it felt like something, or someone, was listening. We kept going until we found a room marked archives. I remember Mark stopped and gave us this mischievous grin. "Should we go in?" "Be my guest," I mumbled, trying not to show my nerves. But inside, I was freaking out. We stepped into the room, and it was like stepping back in time. There were shelves piled with dusty old papers and medical files. I remember seeing one labeled Patients Ward 6 and pulling it off the shelf. And then, I froze. My name was written right there, clear as day. Not just mine, but Mark's, Dan's, and, well, all of ours. It didn't make sense. At first, we thought it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe a coincidence. But as we flipped through more files, each one listed details that were oddly specific. Birth dates, hometowns, stuff that shouldn't have been there. "What the hell?" Dan whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was alive, like it was breathing us in, swallowing us up. We tried to laugh it off, but the tension was building. Everything was coated in this thick layer of dust, but some items looked like they'd been disturbed recently, like someone had touched them. And then I heard it. This faint rustling, just behind me. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the shadows, but there was nothing there. Just empty space and more shadows stretching down the corridor. But it felt like something was there, watching. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, noticing my expression. "I just thought I saw something," I whispered back. "Probably just my imagination." Just then, our flashlights started flickering, cutting in and out. I'd been in creepy places before, but this was something else. It was like the darkness had a pulse. We huddled together, all our bravado gone. We knew something was wrong, but none of us wanted to say it out loud. Eventually, we stumbled into an old operating room. The door creaked open, and the moonlight poured in through a broken window, casting just enough light to make out the rusty tools scattered across a table. Scalpels, forceps, all of them covered in what looked like dry blood. We were all dead silent, just staring at those instruments, imagining all the terrible things that could have happened here. I don't know why, but Mark reached out and picked up a scalpel, holding it up like he was studying some ancient artifact. "They probably cut people open with this," he murmured. Just as he said it, something clattered behind us. I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Probably just a rat." Dan tried to laugh it off, but his voice was shaking, too. After that, I remember wanting to turn around and leave. But when we went back to the hallway, the door we come through was shut tight. We tried pulling it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the whole building was trapping us, pulling us deeper into its maze. "Maybe we just took a wrong turn," Jan said, her voice barely a whisper. But we all knew that wasn't it. It felt like the building was shifting, reconfiguring itself around us. So we kept going, looking for another way out. Every corridor looked the same, long, endless stretches of peeling paint and broken lights. We passed old posters on the walls, faded slogans about hygiene and safety, ironic reminders of a place that was anything but safe. Then, suddenly, we found ourselves in a big room with shattered windows. Outside, we could see the dark outlines of trees, but it felt like we were miles away from civilization. The room was empty, except for one strange thing. On the floor, there was a piece of paper. I picked it up, and scrawled in smudged ink, it read, "They will return." I showed it to the others, and for the first time, we all felt the same fear. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was haunted by memories, by something that didn't want us to leave. Something that was hungry for us to stay. Part 2, The Vanishing. We stood in silence, each of us holding our breath, as the weight of that cryptic note sank in. "They will return." I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out the quiet whispers of the wind sneaking through the cracked windows. Dan was the first to break the silence. "Look, this is ridiculous. Someone probably just left it here to scare idiots like us," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. He glanced at the note again and then quickly looked away, like he couldn't bear to see it. Mark nodded, his usual bravado faltering a bit. "Let's keep moving. We've got to find another way out." But he didn't sound as confident as he usually did. None of us did. As we continued down the hallway, the air grew colder, sharper somehow. Our flashlights flickered, illuminating only bits and pieces of the path ahead. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, giving the place an even more unsettling feel. After a while, Jan noticed something strange. "Didn't we already pass this door?" she whispered, pointing at a rusted metal door labeled storage room. The paint on it was peeling, revealing ugly scars of rust beneath. "No way," Mark said, but his voice didn't carry the usual firmness. We all stopped, staring at the door as if it might answer us. Slowly, Mark turned the handle and pushed it open. Inside, it was pitch black. Our flashlights revealed a small room packed with broken equipment, old fork stands, shattered jars, dusty lab coats. The smell of mold and decay was overpowering. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but it felt wrong, like the room was hiding something, or like it was watching us. "All right, enough," Dan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get out of here. Now." As we turned to leave, I felt a sudden, cold grip on my arm. I yelped, looking around, but no one was there. My friend stared at me in shock, but before I could say anything, a faint whisper echoed through the hallway, sending chills down our spines. "Help me." It was barely audible, more like a sigh than a voice, but we all heard it. And it was enough to make us start moving faster. We hurried down the corridor, glancing nervously behind us. Every time we looked back, the darkness seemed closer, like it was following us, closing in. But that's when things got worse. We were just about to turn another corner when Jan, who was walking ahead, suddenly stopped. Her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the shadows, a figure, barely visible, standing just out of reach. And then Jan was gone. 1 second, she was right there in front of us. The next, she had vanished into thin air. Her flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam bouncing across the walls, casting eerie shadows. "Jan!" Mark shouted, his voice echoing down the hallway. He lunged forward, grabbing her flashlight as if it might somehow bring her back. "Jan, where are you?" We searched the area frantically, our voices growing more panicked with each unanswered call. But there was nothing, no sign of her, no footsteps, no shadow darting through the darkness. She had simply disappeared. Dan was shaking now, his face pale as he muttered under his breath. "This isn't happening. This can't be real. She was right here." I felt a cold sweat running down my spine. The fear was clawing at me, making it hard to breathe, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe she just went ahead, got scared, ran off to find another way out. But even I didn't believe it. Mark took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "All right, we need to stay together. No one wanders off alone. We'll keep searching, but we have to stick together, okay?" We nodded, too terrified to argue. Our flashlights felt like fragile lifelines, barely cutting through the heavy darkness that seemed to pulse around us. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the soft rustle of the stale air, felt amplified, like the whole building was breathing around us. As we made our way through another corridor, we passed by more abandoned rooms. In one of them, I saw a row of dusty, cracked mirrors lining the wall. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the reflection, a quick flash of movement, like a shadow darting behind us. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway stretching into the dark. "Do you guys see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark and Dan stopped, looking at the mirrors. They were all cracked, some so much that it was hard to see anything clearly. But as we looked closer, we saw something strange. In one of the mirrors, there was a faint outline of January. She was standing there, staring back at us, her face pale and expressionless. "Jan?" Dan called out, his voice barely audible. The reflection didn't move, didn't react. And then, slowly, it smiled, a cold, eerie smile that sent a wave of terror through me. I stumbled back, and when I looked at the mirror again, she was gone. Just an empty, broken reflection. "We need to get out of here," Dan muttered, his voice shaking. We turned away from the mirrors, trying to ignore the lingering image of Jan's smile. But as we continued down the corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, that the shadows were growing darker, closing in around us. Eventually, we reached another room, this one larger, filled with rows of dusty beds, each with old, rusted restraints hanging off the sides. The sight was unnerving, to say the least. And just as we were about to leave, the lights flickered again, casting strange, dancing shadows across the room. And then, we heard it again. That faint, desperate whisper. "Help me." Only this time, it sounded closer. And it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from within the room. Mark raised his flashlight, scanning the beds. At first, we saw nothing. Just empty, dusty cots. But then, in the far corner, something shifted. There was a figure lying on one of the beds, barely visible, as if it was cloaked in shadows. I took a step back, my pulse racing. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Mark nodded, his face pale. Yeah, I see it." We moved closer, inching toward the figure, each of us gripping our flashlights like they were weapons. The closer we got, the clearer the figure became. It was January. She was lying there, motionless, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, her face frozen in that same eerie smile. "Jan?" Mark reached out, his hand trembling as he touched her shoulder. The moment he did, her eyes snapped toward him, wide and unblinking. Her mouth moved, forming words without sound, and then, in that same whisper, she said, "You shouldn't have come." Part 3. The shadows close in. After Jan vanished, silence settled around us like a thick, suffocating fog. No one said a word. Fear had gripped us all, leaving us staring at the empty bed where Jan had been only moments before. My hands were trembling so hard that I had to use both of them to keep the flashlight steady. "We have to keep moving," Mark finally whispered, though his voice sounded faint, almost unrecognizable. His face was pale, and I saw fear in his eyes, the same fear that was gripping all of us. Dan nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty bed, his face ashen and blank. Together, we backed out of the room, each step slower than the last. The shadows seemed darker, thicker, as though the hospital was pressing in around us, feeding off our fear. Every sound, the creak of our footsteps, the shuffle of dust under our feet, felt amplified, making it seem like the entire building was listening to us, waiting. Our flashlights began flickering again, casting strange shadows that made everything look even more eerie. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see Jan's face staring back from the darkness, her cold smile etched in memory. The image of her haunted me, each step deepening the terror that gripped my heart. After what felt like hours, we reached a staircase leading down to the basement. The entrance was blocked by a rusty metal gate, barely hanging onto its hinges. Mark hesitated, shining his flashlight into the darkness below. "I don't like this," I muttered, feeling a shiver crawl up my spine. "Neither do I," Dan agreed, looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else. But it was clear that every other route led us back to this spot. This was the only path we hadn't tried. Mark took a deep breath and shoved against the gate with all his weight. After a few moments, it gave way with a creaking groan that echoed down the corridor, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. We descended the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a descent into something we couldn't understand. The air grew colder, heavier, and the smell of mold filled our noses. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long, dimly lit corridor lined with doors on either side. The walls were stained, cracked, and covered in peeling paint. Dark streaks on the floor and walls resembled dried blood. "Do you think this is where they kept people?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mark nodded grimly. "Yeah. I think this is where the real horrors happened." We opened the first door on the left, revealing a small, cramped room filled with old medical equipment, scalpels, syringes, glass jars filled with murky liquid. Some of the jars held small, grisly items, teeth, bits of bone, and other unidentifiable fragments. I felt my stomach turn, but I forced myself to stay calm. Dan was staring at a jar with what looked like a severed finger floating inside, his face frozen in horror. Who would keep something like this? This wasn't just a hospital, Mark muttered, looking around. It was an experiment, a prison. We moved on, checking the other rooms. Some were empty, while others held more disturbing items, chains bolted to walls, leather straps on tables, strange symbols scratched into the paint. Each room felt like it held a piece of a darker, twisted history. Eventually, we reached a door at the end of the hall. Unlike the others, it was untouched by decay, standing eerily intact. I felt a sudden sense of dread just looking at it. "Maybe we shouldn't go in there," I whispered, feeling every instinct telling me to turn around. But Mark was already reaching for the handle. He glanced back at us, his face pale and scared, but he wasn't about to back down now. Slowly, he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was pitch black. Our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only fragments of what lay inside. In the center of the room was a single chair, its leather straps hanging loosely from the arms. Dark stains covered the seat. On the walls, words had been scrawled in dark, smeared ink, or perhaps something worse. Asterisk, they never leave. Asterisk. The words were repeated over and over, covering every inch of the walls and ceiling. Some letters were scratched so deeply it looked like someone had dug them into the surface with bare hands. "What the hell?" Dan whispered, his voice trembling. Suddenly, a faint, static hum filled the room, like an old radio crackling to life. I looked around, but there were no speakers, no radio, just that eerie, buzzing sound. The hum grew louder, filling the room until it was almost deafening. And then, through the static, we heard it, a faint, broken whisper that sounded like dozens of voices all at once, speaking over each other, crying, whispering, pleading. It sounded like a chorus of despair. Mark took a step back, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." But before we could move, the door slammed shut behind us, trapping us inside. I lunged for the handle, yanking on it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, clawing at the edges of my mind. And then we saw them, shadows, stretching across the walls, forming twisted, human-like shapes with hollow, staring eyes. They moved toward us slowly, almost hungrily, circling us, reaching out with long, clawed fingers. "Stay together," Mark shouted, pulling us into a tight circle. We huddled in the center of the room, our flashlights flickering as the shadows closed in, pressing against us from all sides. I felt something icy brush against my arm, and a chill shot through me. I looked down, and there was a dark bruise forming where the shadow had touched me. My skin was cold, numb. Please just let us go," I whispered, my voice shaking with terror. The shadows stopped, wavering as though uncertain. And then, in a voice that was barely human, we heard it, a single, guttural word that echoed through the room. "Stay." The lights went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. I felt the shadows pressing in around us, suffocating, their presence cold and heavy. And in that darkness, I felt a hand, a solid, freezing hand, grip my shoulder. I screamed, jerking away, but there was no one there. Just the dark, the whispers, and the cold. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the room was empty. The shadows were gone, the whispers had faded, and the door was open. We didn't waste any time. We ran, stumbling over each other in our panic. We didn't stop until we were out of the basement, back in the main hallway. Only then did we pause, gasping for breath, each of us pale and shaken. But as I tried to steady myself, I noticed something chilling. My arm, where the shadow had touched me, was still cold, numb, the bruise spreading darker and deeper across my skin. And in the silence, I realized something terrible. The voices hadn't really stopped. They were still there, faint, lingering in the back of my mind. And I knew they would never leave. Part 4, the ritual room. The cold air outside should have brought relief, but instead, it only deepened the fear gnawing at my chest. We had escaped the hospital, or so we thought, but the strange, suffocating presence seemed to linger around us, clinging to us like a shadow we couldn't shake. Dan looked back at the building, his face pale. Why does it feel like it's still watching us?" Mark pulled up his sleeve, revealing a bruise where one of the shadowy figures had touched him. It was dark, pulsing, almost alive. I glanced down at my own arm, finding a similar mark, dark and cold, like an imprint left by the shadows that still haunted us. "We need to get out of here," I said, forcing down the panic that bubbled up inside. We started walking, putting distance between us and the hospital. But no matter how far we went, the building remained visible, looming over us like it was still pulling us back. Every road we took, every turn, led us back to its shadowed entrance, as if we were trapped in a loop with no way out. "This is impossible," Dan muttered, panic rising in his voice. It's like we're not actually going anywhere." Mark clenched his jaw, his face filled with fear. "It's not letting us leave. I think we're still trapped. The realization sank in with a chilling certainty. It wasn't enough to simply walk away. The hospital had claimed us, and it wasn't going to let us go without something in return. Mark looked back at the building, his gaze fixed on the door. "The book," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I took it from the altar. It was a part of this place, and now it won't let us go." A sick feeling settled in my stomach. The book. Mark had taken it, breaking some ancient, unspoken rule. Whatever curse bound that place was now bound to us too. "We're not going back in there," Dan insisted, his voice shaking. But we all knew there was no other choice. The hospital wasn't going to let us leave until we returned what we'd taken, until we put things back the way they were. Reluctantly, we turned back toward the hospital, dread settling in my bones. It felt like the building was waiting for us, watching with cold, unfeeling eyes. When we reached the doors, they were open, inviting us back in. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle, feeling the chill emanating from within. Every instinct screamed to run, but we were past the point of escape. We stepped inside, and the doors shut heavily behind us, sealing us in. The air was colder, thicker, as though the hospital had tightened its grip. Our footsteps echoed down the silent halls as we made our way to the room where Mark had found the book. When we reached the room, the door was slightly ajar. Inside, the darkness was so thick that our flashlights barely cut through it. The stone altar was there, its surface cracked and worn, the strange symbols etched deeply into it. And there, lying in the center, was the book. Mark stepped forward, his face set with grim determination. "If I put it back, maybe it will let us go." He placed the book back on the altar, and we waited, our breaths held. But the silence only grew heavier, colder. Nothing changed. The shadows around us seemed to thicken, as if mocking us. "It's not enough," I whispered, a sickening dread creeping over me. "It's not just the book. This place wants something more." Dan's face drained of color. "What do you mean?" Mark stared at the altar, his face pale but resolute. "It needs a sacrifice. Blood, or something else. It's part of the ritual." The words sent a chill through me. The hospital wasn't just a building, it was a trap, a twisted labyrinth that demanded something in return for our escape. We had taken something from it, and now, to leave, we'd have to give something back. Mark took out a pocket knife, his hand trembling as he held it over his palm. "If blood is what it needs, then that's what it will get." Before I could stop him, he cut a shallow line across his palm, letting a few drops fall onto the altar. The room seemed to react, the air thickening as a faint vibration rippled through the floor. The shadows shifted, pulling back slightly, as though they were watching. But it wasn't enough. The silence gave way to whispers, growing louder, filling the room with a tortured chorus of voices, crying, pleading, angry. The shadows pressed in again, their hollow eyes fixed on us, their forms reaching, clawing toward us. Dan's voice shook as he whispered, What more does it want?" Mark stepped back, his face pale, his hand bleeding. "I don't know." But I understood. The hospital didn't just want blood, it wanted something deeper, something we each had to give. A part of ourselves. Without thinking, I placed my hand on the altar, feeling its cold, rough surface. A strange sensation filled me, as if something was being pulled from me, a memory, an emotion. I could feel it slipping away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Dan followed suit, his hand trembling as he touched the altar. A similar look crossed his face, a mix of pain and loss, as if a piece of him had been taken. The whispers faded, replaced by a heavy silence. The shadows withdrew, their forms dissolving back into the darkness, watching us with cold, unfeeling eyes. We stumbled back from the altar, the weight of the hospital's presence lifting slightly. The room felt less oppressive, as though the building had loosened its grip. "It's done," Mark whispered, relief and exhaustion etched into his face. "Let's go." We turned and made our way back through the dark corridors, each step feeling lighter, freer, as if the hospital was finally releasing us. We reached the main doors, and for the first time, they opened easily, letting in the cool night air. As we stepped outside, the oppressive feeling lifted, replaced by a quiet, empty calm. We had escaped. But as we walked away, I noticed the bruises on our arms, darker than before, spreading like shadows beneath our skin. They were marks, reminders of the price we had paid, of the part of ourselves we'd left behind. And in the back of my mind, I could still hear the whispers, faint but insistent, like an echo that would follow me forever. Part 5, the final offering. We thought it was over. The hospital had let us go, and the cold night air felt like freedom as we stumbled away. But each of us wore a mark now, a dark, spreading bruise where the shadows had touched us. And as we walked, that same heavy, sickening feeling crept back, like invisible chains pulling us back toward that cursed place. Why does it feel like we're still there? Dan whispered, glancing over his shoulder. Mark clenched his jaw, his hand pressing against the bruise on his arm. Maybe we never really left. The silence that followed was thick with fear. Every road, every path we tried to take out of that forest led us back to the same spot, the hospital, looming dark and silent in the distance. It was like some cruel trick, a loop that wouldn't let us break free. "We're trapped," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. It didn't really let us go. Dan's face went pale, his gaze fixed on the hospital. We did everything it asked. We gave it what it wanted. Why won't it let us go? Mark looked down at his hands, shaking his head. Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe it needs more. The thought settled over us like a death sentence. We knew we couldn't stay out here. We'd try every way out. It was only a matter of time before the hospital would pull us back in completely. With heavy steps, we turned and walked back toward the entrance, each of us feeling the weight of what was to come. When we reached the doors, they opened on their own, welcoming us back into the darkness. The cold air hit us like a wave, and we shivered as we stepped inside. The familiar scent of decay and damp stone was stronger, sharper now, filling our lungs with every breath. The whispers were there too, faint but insistent, beckoning us deeper into the building. We walked through the shadowed halls, our footsteps echoing as we made our way back to the ritual room. The bruises on our arms pulsed, throbbing with each step, as if they were guiding us, pulling us towards something that waited in the dark. When we entered the room, the altar stood in the center, dark and foreboding, the strange symbols carved into its surface glowing faintly. The book lay open on the altar, its pages filled with cryptic words we couldn't read, as though the hospital had left it there, waiting for us. Mark stepped forward, his face pale but determined. If it's more than it wants, then we'll give it more. He reached for the book, flipping through its pages until he found something, a passage written in jagged, looping handwriting, the words twisted and contorted, as if they were alive. His voice was low, trembling as he read the words aloud. To leave, an offering must be made. Blood, memory, fear, and soul, a final sacrifice must be given for freedom. The meaning of the words hit us all at once. The hospital didn't just want blood or fear. It wanted something deeper, something we couldn't get back once it was given. Dan shook his head, his face twisted with fear. No, there has to be another way. Mark closed the book, his expression hardening. There is no other way. We've tried everything. It's either this, or we stay here forever. The reality of it settled over us, suffocating. We couldn't escape unless we gave up a part of ourselves, something that would forever bind us to this place. It was a final offering, one that required a piece of our very souls. Mark pulled out his pocket knife, his hand trembling as he held it over his palm. I wanted to stop him, to tell him not to go through with it, but I knew there was no choice. With a quick, shallow cut, he let a few drops of blood fall onto the altar. The room seemed to shudder, the walls shifting as a faint light flickered from the symbols etched into the stone. But it wasn't enough. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, rising into a tortured chorus that echoed off the walls. The shadows in the room thickened, pressing in around us, their hollow eyes fixed on us with an intensity that felt like needles piercing my skin. Dan took a shaky breath, stepping forward to join Mark at the altar. He placed his hand on the stone, his face twisted in pain as he let go of something, a piece of himself. I could see the change in him, a hollow look in his eyes as if something vital had been taken from him. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I pressed it against the cold stone. I closed my eyes, feeling a strange, pulling sensation as though the altar were drawing something from deep within me, a memory, a feeling, a part of who I was. I felt it slip away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The whispers stopped, the silence pressing down on us, suffocating. But as I pulled my hand away, I felt a strange, numbing cold creep over me, as if a part of me had been left behind on that altar. The shadows receded slightly, watching us with hollow eyes, as though they were considering our offering. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, the book on the altar flipped open again, its pages fluttering as if touched by an invisible hand. Mark looked down, his face pale as he read the new passage that had appeared. To be free, you must give more. One soul must remain. One must stay for the others to leave. The words sank in slowly, their meaning like a knife twisting in my chest. It wasn't enough to give parts of ourselves. The hospital demanded a full sacrifice. One of us had to stay behind, bound to this place forever. Dan's face went pale, his eyes wide with horror. No. This can't be happening. Mark closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as the weight of it hit him. It's the only way. One of us has to stay, or none of us will ever leave. The reality of it pressed down on us like a crushing weight. We come in together, but now one of us would have to be left behind. There was silence, thick and suffocating, as we each grappled with the decision. I wanted to say something, to argue, but I knew it was pointless. The hospital's rules were absolute. We couldn't escape them. Mark finally looked up, his gaze fixed on me. And Dan, I'll stay, he said quietly. This was my idea. I brought you all here. If anyone deserves to stay, it's me. Dan shook his head, his voice choked with emotion. No, Mark. We're not leaving you here. Mark gave a sad smile, his face filled with a resigned calm. It has to be someone. If you don't go, then this place will never let any of us leave. Before we could stop him, he turned back to the altar, placing his hand on the stone. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him, their dark forms swirling around him like a black fog. He looked at us one last time, his face peaceful. Go, he whispered. Get out of here, while you still can. With those final words, the shadows pulled him into the darkness, his figure fading as he disappeared into the void. The room shuddered, the walls shifting, as if the building itself had accepted his offering. The whispers faded, replaced by a heavy silence that filled the space. The shadows retreated, dissolving into the darkness, leaving us standing alone in the empty room. We stumbled back, our steps heavy as we made our way out of the hospital. The doors opened easily this time, the night air spilling in, fresh and cold. We stepped outside, each of us feeling the weight of what we'd left behind. But as we walked away, I could still feel the cold in my bones, a reminder of what had happened, of the friend we'd left behind in the shadows. And in the silence, I could still hear his whisper, faint but clear, like an echo that would haunt me forever. Part 6, The Haunting Echo. We left the hospital, but none of us felt free. The night was heavy, pressing down on us with a weight that seemed impossible to shake. Mark was gone, sacrificed to whatever twisted forces ruled that place, and though we were outside, breathing the cold night air, his absence was as palpable as the bruises that lingered on our arms. Dan walked beside me, his face pale and blank, his eyes staring into the distance. I could tell he was barely processing what had just happened, his mind trapped in a loop of shock and disbelief. I felt the same. It didn't seem real. But every time I glanced back, the dark outline of the hospital reminded me that it was. We really left him there, Dan said, his voice breaking. We just left him. I had no words, only the guilt and pain that had settled in my chest like a lead weight. Mark had chosen to stay so we could escape, but instead of feeling relieved, I felt hollow, haunted by the memory of his face as he looked at us one last time. We didn't have a choice, I whispered, though the words felt empty, meaningless. It was him or all of us. Dan shook his head, clenching his fists. We shouldn't have gone in there. This was never supposed to happen. It was just a stupid dare." His voice cracked, and he looked away, his expression twisted with grief and anger. I didn't blame him. I felt the same. What had started as a thrill, a dare to spend one night in a haunted hospital, had ended in horror, and we had all paid a price. We walked in silence, each step taking us further from the hospital, but it felt like we were still there, like the shadows of that place had followed us, lingering in the cold night air. I glanced down at the bruise on my arm, dark and pulsing, a reminder of the shadows that had touched me, marking me as part of that cursed place. As we reached the edge of the woods, I felt an icy shiver run down my spine. I stopped, glancing back, expecting to see the hospital still looming behind us, but there was only darkness, the faint outline of trees against the night sky. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over, that we truly escaped. But then, faintly, I heard it, a whisper, so quiet I thought it was the wind. A voice, familiar and haunting, calling my name. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to hear. The whisper faded, leaving only silence, but I knew what I'd heard. It was Mark. Or at least, something that sounded like him. The thought sent a chill through me, and I stumbled forward, desperate to put more distance between myself and that cursed place. Dan seemed to sense it too. He sped up, his footsteps quickening as if he could outrun the memories. But no matter how far we went, I could feel it lingering in the air, like a weight pressing down on us, a reminder that we'd left a piece of ourselves behind. When we finally reached the edge of town, dawn was beginning to break, casting a faint light over the silent streets. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. We didn't speak as we made our way to our homes, each of us lost in our thoughts, haunted by what we'd left behind. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the last few hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face, his final look as the shadows had swallowed him. I could still hear his voice, echoing in my mind, a haunting whisper that refused to fade. I turned over, trying to shut it out, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But as the minutes passed, the whispers grew louder, filling the silence of my room until it felt like they were pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, the same numb, icy feeling I'd felt in the hospital. And then, I heard it clearly, a voice, faint and hollow, calling my name. "Come back." I sat up, my heart pounding, glancing around the room. It was empty, but the air felt thick, heavy, as though something unseen was watching me. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just a nightmare, a trick of my mind. But the whispers didn't stop. They lingered, fading in and out, like an echo that refused to die. I wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, Dan and I tried to resume our lives, but it was impossible to escape the memories, the guilt. Every night, I heard the whispers, growing louder, more insistent. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of shadows in the corner of my eye, fleeting but unmistakable, as though the hospital had followed me, leaving fragments of itself in my mind. Dan was faring no better. When I finally saw him again, he looked pale, exhausted, his eyes haunted. He told me he was having the same dreams, the same whispers, the same sense that something was following him. He tried to ignore it, but the fear was growing, feeding off the silence, the darkness. "It's like he's still here," Dan whispered, his voice shaking. Like Mark never really left. I felt the same. Each day, the weight of the whispers grew, filling my thoughts, my dreams, until I could barely tell what was real and what was a memory. The bruise on my arm had faded, but the cold remained, a constant reminder that a part of me was still trapped in that place. Desperate for answers, I went back to the forest one night, drawn by a need to understand, to confront whatever was haunting me. The hospital loomed in the distance, silent and dark, its windows like empty eyes watching me as I approached. As I reached the entrance, I heard it again, a whisper, clear and insistent, calling my name. It was Mark's voice, but hollow, distorted, as though it had been twisted by the darkness of that place. "Come back, we're waiting." The words sent a chill through me, and I stopped, frozen, staring up at the building. I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me, filling the air with a suffocating dread. But despite the fear, I felt a strange pull, a need to go back, to face whatever was waiting inside. Just as I was about to step forward, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, finding Dan standing behind me, his face pale, his expression grim. "You can't go back," he whispered, his voice filled with fear. "If you go back, you'll never leave." I hesitated, my mind torn between the pull of the whispers and the warning in Dan's eyes. The hospital felt like a magnet, drawing me in, feeding on my fear, my guilt. But I knew he was right. Going back meant surrendering, becoming part of that place forever. With one last look at the hospital, I turned away, forcing myself to walk back into the forest, the whispers fading as I put more distance between myself and the building. But even as I left, I could feel it lingering, a dark presence that would never truly go away. In the days that followed, the whispers faded, but the memory of that night remained, haunting me in the quiet moments, in the darkness. I knew that a part of me had been left behind, trapped in that cursed place with Mark. And though I tried to move on, to forget, I knew the hospital would always be there, waiting, a dark shadow at the edge of my thoughts. Sometimes, late at night, I could still hear it, a faint whisper, calling my name, a reminder of the price we had paid and the friend we had left behind. And in those moments, I would close my eyes, feeling the cold settle over me, and wonder if I, too, would one day be drawn back to that place, never to leave again. Part 7. The Lingering Shadows. Months passed, but the events of that night stayed with me. I'd hear Mark's voice in quiet moments, a faint whisper that would rise like a memory before fading back into silence. Dan and I tried to move on, but the memories of gray pines were always there, like scars beneath the skin. One night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows in my room seemed to deepen, and a familiar chill settled over me. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, and there it was, the faintest whisper, calling my name, pleading, "Come back." I wanted to believe it was just a fragment of my imagination, a lingering effect of the trauma. But deep down, I knew the truth. A part of me was still bound to that place, and the hospital wasn't done with me. Dan called me a few days later, his voice trembling. He'd been hearing it too. The same whispers, the same pull. We'd both tried to move on, to convince ourselves that we were safe. But the shadows of gray pines were insistent, clawing at the edges of our minds, their cold touch seeping into our daily lives. "Do you think it'll ever stop?" Dan asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to tell him yes, that one day the memories would fade, and we'd be free. But as I sat in the quiet, feeling the weight of the hospital's lingering presence, I knew that wasn't true. Gray pines had taken its toll, leaving its mark on us. We could run, we could hide, but its shadows would follow, whispering, reminding us of what we'd left behind. And in the dead of night, when the world was silent, I'd still hear Mark's voice, calling out from the darkness, a reminder that some places never truly let you go. Part 1. The Forgotten Asylum of Blackwood Grove. Blackwood Grove Asylum had been abandoned for decades, hidden deep within an overgrown forest. The building stood like a skeleton against the sky, its once grand walls twisted and crumbling. Local legends told of strange happenings, inhumane treatments, and mysterious disappearances. Most avoided the place, swearing that it was haunted by the spirits of those lost in its dark halls. But a group of friends, Eli, Matt, Rachel, and Chloe, weren't afraid of a few ghost stories. Determined to explore, they made a plan to spend the night in the asylum. Armed with flashlights, snacks, and a mixture of excitement and unease, they ventured into the forest under the light of a waning moon. The building came into view slowly, half-shrouded in fog that seemed to cling to its broken windows. They paused, feeling a chill settle over them, as though they'd stepped into a world where time stood still. The asylum's front doors hung crooked on their hinges, the open entry like a gaping mouth. "Well, we're here," Matt said, trying to sound confident, though his voice wavered slightly. "No turning back now." Eli gave a reassuring nod, stepping toward the door. "Just an old building, right? What's there to worry about?" Chloe exchanged a nervous glance with Rachel, who shrugged and took a steadying breath. Together, They crossed the threshold, stepping into the darkness of the asylum's main hall. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot, and the beam from their flashlights revealed peeling wallpaper, cracked walls, and broken furniture scattered across the floor. "Welcome to Blackwood Grove Asylum," Chloe said, trying to sound cheerful, though her voice trembled slightly. "Population, us." They made their way deeper into the building, each step seeming to stir the dust into ghostly spirals in the flashlight beams. Scrawled graffiti covered the walls, warning messages from past explorers, *, "Don't stay after dark." *, "They never left." Eli laughed nervously, brushing his hand over one of the messages. "People really like to spook each other, huh?" he said, though he sounded more uncertain than he wanted to admit. As they continued down the hallway, the building felt larger, as if it were stretching around them. They tried to stay together, but the narrow passageways and endless doors made it easy to lose track of direction. They quickly found themselves lost, wandering the eerie corridors of the asylum with no idea how to get back. "Didn't we already pass this hallway?" Rachel whispered, shining her flashlight on a familiar-looking door. Matt nodded, his face tense. "It all looks the same, but yeah, I think we've been here before." They tried to retrace their steps, but every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the asylum. Their laughter faded, replaced by a tense silence as they realized the layout made no sense. It was as if the asylum were guiding them, twisting the corridors to trap them. Eventually, they entered a large, empty room with rows of metal beds, each fitted with leather straps and metal cuffs. Rust covered every surface, but the beds looked disturbingly intact, as though they had been left in a hurry and never touched again. The silence was suffocating. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Chloe said, shuddering as she looked around. "What were they even doing here?" Rachel shined her flashlight over a set of cabinets against the wall. Inside, she saw old patient files, the paper brittle and yellowed. She carefully picked one up, skimming the faded type. It detailed experimental treatments, extended isolation, and restraint therapies that sent chills down her spine. It was clear that this place hadn't been a refuge for the mentally ill, it had been a prison. "Guys, something terrible happened here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. These weren't treatments. They were experiments. Eli shifted uneasily, glancing back toward the door. "Maybe we should get out of here." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from down the corridor, like a door slamming shut. They froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. "Just the wind?" Matt whispered, though his voice trembled. They continued through the asylum, the halls seeming to grow darker, colder. The faint sound of whispers seemed to follow them, vanishing whenever they turned to look, leaving only silence. Each room they passed was filled with disturbing relics, restraints, stained surgical tools, even what looked like padded cells with scratch marks on the walls. Finally, they found themselves in a room that looked like a doctor's office, with a large, rusted desk and several dusty medical files strewn about. An old, cracked patient chair sat in the corner, restraints hanging loosely from its arms. On the desk was an open journal, its pages filled with hurried, scrawled handwriting. Chloe leaned in, reading aloud. *, "The shadows grow stronger. I can hear them at night, whispering, calling my name. The patients, they're gone, but their spirits linger. I fear I'll join them soon, *. The journal entries grew more frantic, the handwriting erratic, describing strange phenomena, patients who vanished without a trace, voices echoing in empty rooms, and the constant feeling of being watched. A cold dread settled over the group as they realized the writer had been a doctor who'd once worked there, someone who had witnessed the asylum's darkest days. His last entry read simply, *, "One must stay. One must stay so the rest may go free. *. A sudden chill swept through the room, and the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Rachel backed away from the journal, her face pale. "Did anyone else feel that?" she asked, looking around nervously. But before anyone could answer, they heard it, a faint, desperate whisper from the hallway. "Help me!" They turned toward the sound, their flashlights sweeping over the empty corridor, but they saw nothing. Just darkness stretching endlessly before them. "We need to leave," Matt said, his voice tight with fear. "This place, It's not right. But as they turned to go, the door slammed shut, trapping them in the room. They ran to it, pulling, pushing, but it wouldn't budge. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Then, as if from nowhere, a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, a shadowy, indistinct form, standing perfectly still. They couldn't make out a face, but they felt its gaze, cold and penetrating, as it watched them with a silent, ominous presence. The figure took a step forward, its hand reaching out. And then, in a voice filled with sorrow and anger, it whispered again, "One stays, the rest may go." They realized, horrified, that the asylum had trapped them with an ultimatum. If they wanted to leave, one of them would have to stay behind, bound to this place forever. Part 2. The Asylum's Demand. The figure in the hallway was moving closer, its form barely visible but radiating an oppressive presence. Eli, Matt, Rachel, and Chloe huddled together, fear twisting their faces as the realization set in. The asylum had trapped them, demanding a sacrifice to let the others go. What does it mean?" Chloe whispered, her voice shaking. Rachel's eyes were wide with terror as she remembered the doctor's journal. It said, "One must stay so the others may go free. I think someone has to stay here, forever." "No way," Eli said, his voice edged with panic. "This is crazy. It's just some trick, some illusion, or maybe even a prank. It can't be real." The shadowy figure paused, its form flickering in the dim light. Then, it raised a hand, pointing toward the end of the hallway, as if inviting them to follow. The whispering grew louder, filling their minds, urging them to move. "Let's just go," Matt said, his voice trembling. "Maybe we can outrun it." They backed away, heading toward the other end of the corridor. But each turn they took only led them deeper into the asylum, the hallways twisting and stretching in impossible ways. The rooms they passed seemed to pulse with a strange energy, their contents distorted as if viewed through fogged glass. Every door was locked, every window sealed, trapping them in a maze of shadows. Finally, they found themselves back at the large, empty room they'd come across earlier, the one with the rusted gurney at its center. The figure was there, waiting for them, its gaze cold and unyielding. Rachel took a shaky step forward, her voice trembling. What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head, almost as if considering her question. And then, in a voice filled with sorrow and rage, it whispered, "One stays, the others go free." The words sent chills down their spines. It was clear that this wasn't a request, it was a demand. The asylum was haunted by the souls of the lost, and it needed a new one to release its hold on the others. "No, I'm not doing this," Eli said, shaking his head. "There has to be another way. We can't just leave one of us behind." Chloe's face was pale as she looked at the shadowy figure. What if there really isn't another way? What if this is the only way out? Matt took her hand, his voice steady but grim. "We're not going to leave anyone here. We'll find another way." But as they spoke, the figure began to move closer, its form shifting and stretching, filling the room with a sense of dread. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling their minds with images of the past, the patients, the doctors, all the people who had been trapped here, unable to escape. The asylum demanded its sacrifice. Desperation took hold of them as they began frantically searching for any other way out. They pulled at the doors, pounded on the walls, but every attempt was futile. The building seemed to absorb their efforts, growing darker, colder with each passing second. Rachel's voice broke the silence, barely a whisper. What if it's true? What if one of us has to stay?" Her words hung heavy in the air. Each of them knew what it meant, but none wanted to accept it. The figure watched them, patient and unmoving, as though it knew that eventually they'd give in. Matt turned to the others, his face filled with resignation. "If someone has to stay, I'll do it. This whole thing was my idea. I convinced you all to come here. If anyone's responsible, it's me." Chloe shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "No, Matt, you can't. We came here together, we're all responsible." The figure took another step forward, its form seeming to flicker as though caught between worlds. It reached out, pointing toward the gurney at the center of the room, as if to say, "Here is where it ends." Eli took a deep breath, looking at each of his friends in turn. "I can't believe we're even considering this. But if it's the only way." Rachel's hand gripped his, her face pale. "We can't just get into this thing. There has to be another way." But the figure was relentless, its presence growing stronger, filling the air with an unbearable heaviness. They could feel it pressing down on them, a suffocating weight that wouldn't lift until its demand was met. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Chloe took a step forward. Her face was calm, though her eyes held a deep sorrow. "If it's the only way, then I'll do it." Her friends stared at her, horror dawning on their faces. Matt reached for her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "No, Matt. If we keep fighting this, none of us will make it out. I can feel it. The asylum, it won't let us go until it gets what it wants." The shadowy figure seemed to pause, as if acknowledging her words. The whispering softened, turning into a faint hum that echoed through the room. Chloe turned to her friends, her expression filled with sadness but also a strange sense of peace. Promise me you'll remember me." They nodded, tears streaming down their faces, unable to find words. With one last look at them, Chloe stepped toward the gurney, the figure standing beside it, watching her with hollow, empty eyes. As she lay down, the shadows closed in, surrounding her, embracing her in a shroud of darkness. The figure placed its hand on her shoulder, and for a moment, her face twisted in pain before settling into an expression of calm. The whispering faded, the air growing lighter as the oppressive weight lifted. The doors creaked open, and a cold gust of air swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of freedom. Matt, Eli, and Rachel looked back at Chloe one last time, but her form was obscured, surrounded by shadows that pulsed with a strange, otherworldly energy. It was clear she had become part of the asylum, a sacrifice that would forever bind her to its haunted halls. They stumbled out of the room, their legs shaky, their minds numb with grief and guilt. The corridors seemed to straighten, guiding them back to the entrance as if the asylum had released its hold on them. They stepped outside, breathing the night air as the building loomed behind them, silent and still. Days passed, and the friends tried to resume their lives, but the memory of that night lingered like a shadow over them. They felt Chloe's absence like a weight in their chests, haunted by the knowledge of what they'd left behind. Each night, when the world grew quiet, they would hear it, a faint whisper, barely audible, echoing in their minds. It was Chloe's voice, soft and distant, calling their names, a ghostly reminder of the sacrifice she had made. And in the silence, they knew the truth. They had escaped, but they would never truly be free. Part 3. The Return to Blackwood Grove. Months passed, yet Eli, Matt, and Rachel couldn't shake the lingering feeling that Chloe was still with them, trapped in the darkness of Blackwood Grove. Each of them heard faint whispers when they were alone, saw flickers of movement in shadows, and felt the weight of her sacrifice haunting their dreams. The guilt gnawed at them, an ever-present reminder of the price Chloe had paid. Finally, one night, Matt made a decision. "We have to go back," he said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "We left Chloe there. What if we can bring her back?" Rachel and Eli exchanged uneasy glances. Rachel's face paled as she remembered Chloe's last words, how the asylum had claimed her. "Matt, it's too dangerous. You know what happened. We barely made it out. She told us to leave." Matt shook his head, his voice filled with desperation. "I can't keep living like this, hearing her voice every night. If she's still there, still trapped, we have to try. She would have done the same for us." Eli looked down, weighing the risk and the guilt that had haunted them all. He nodded finally, his face pale but resolute. "If you're going back, we're going with you. We owe her that much." Together, they set out toward Blackwood Grove once again, their resolve wavering as they approached the asylum, half hidden in a dense fog. The air was colder than they remembered, the forest seeming darker, the trees bending in twisted shapes as if to shield them from the horrors within. As they crossed the threshold, they felt the same oppressive chill as before, as if the building recognized them, its presence settling over them like a shroud. The asylum had changed. The hallways they had known before were different, twisted. Doors that had once been open were now locked, and every step seemed to lead them in circles, deeper into the asylum's darkness. It was as if the building itself was shifting, guiding them towards something unseen. After what felt like hours of navigating the labyrinthine halls, they found themselves back in the room where Chloe had made her sacrifice. The room looked exactly as they remembered, though dust and shadow had settled over it, like a thin veil of time that had held it untouched. The gurney in the center of the room still bore the memory of that night, the darkness around it heavy and unyielding. And then, a voice, a faint, familiar whisper that made their hearts race. "Why did you come back?" Rachel gasped, recognizing Chloe's voice. She turned, her flashlight trembling as it swept across the room. There, at the edge of the light, a figure began to take shape, faint, ghostly, and filled with sorrow. Chloe's face emerged, her eyes dark and filled with sadness. "Chloe!" Matt's voice broke as he stepped toward her. "We're here to get you out. We couldn't just leave you here." Chloe's expression shifted, a deep sorrow settling over her features. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You weren't supposed to return." Eli stepped back, a cold dread filling his chest. "Chloe, we came to save you. We thought maybe we could bring you home." But Chloe's form began to flicker, her outline wavering as though caught between worlds. The air grew colder, and a dark presence filled the room, pressing against them with an unseen force. Her voice, once warm, now held a chill that made them shiver. "It won't let me leave. I belong to it now, and now that you're here," her voice trailed off, a sadness in her eyes that made them realize the terrible truth. "What do you mean?" Rachel asked, her voice a trembling whisper. Chloe's gaze turned to Matt, her face filled with regret. "It doesn't release its hold. You've broken the deal. You came back, and now none of us can leave." A shiver ran through the group as the room darkened, shadows creeping along the walls, twisting into distorted forms. The asylum had sensed their return, and it was no longer willing to let them go. The doors creaked, sealing shut, and the walls seemed to close in around them, filling the air with a suffocating darkness. They tried to back away, to escape, but the figure of Chloe stood between them and the exit, her face filled with a haunting mixture of sorrow and warning. She looked at them, her form flickering as the shadows pulsed around her. "I wanted you to remember me," she whispered, her voice filled with regret. "But now, it's too late." Matt reached out, desperation in his eyes. "No, Chloe, we're not leaving you here. We'll find a way, together. We can fight it." But her hand passed through his, cold and insubstantial. Her face twisted with pain, and she shook her head, backing away. "The asylum has claimed me. I tried to warn you." As her form began to fade, the shadows surged forward, filling the room, pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to pulse, bending in impossible ways, as though the asylum itself were alive, tightening its hold around them. The last thing they saw was Chloe's sorrowful face, caught in the flickering darkness, her eyes pleading as she whispered one final warning. "Run, before it takes you too." But it was too late. The darkness swallowed them, pulling them into the depths of the asylum. Their voices echoed in the empty halls, lost in the shadows as Blackwood Grove claimed its new souls, binding them forever to its haunted halls. When dawn broke over the forest, Blackwood Grove lay silent once more, its twisted corridors waiting for the next lost souls to cross its threshold, forever cursed to claim those who dared disturb the quiet of its haunted past. Preview of a new story, The Echoes of Briarwood Manor. Briarwood Manor had stood abandoned for decades, a towering relic of tragedy. Long ago, a fire had swept through the house, claiming the lives of an entire family and leaving the structure scarred. Now, it lay in ruins, the grand halls reduced to shadows and silence. Locals whispered that on certain nights, footsteps could be heard pacing through the charred remains, and flickering lights appeared in the broken windows. When a team of paranormal investigators decided to spend the night, they thought it would be a simple case of debunking local folklore. But as they delved deeper into Briarwood's history, they uncovered something far darker, a mystery hidden within the walls, an echo of something that refused to die. As the night wore on, they began to realize they were not alone. Doors that had been closed were now open, rooms shifted and transformed, trapping them in a maze that seemed intent on keeping them within. And then the whispers began, calling each of them by name, urging them to uncover the secrets that had burned but never faded. The deeper they went, the closer they came to understanding the true horror of Briarwood Manor, and the reason its spirits would never let them leave.